Hello and welcome. Today we are in the new Tier 10 Soviet Battleship, Slava. She is not a work in progress despite what the sign says in the corner. There was a little mix-up and I had it on there during a recording. Slava is a battleship that is very good at range. She has fast shells, they are accurate, they have good penetration, and you'll see it in action in a moment. I fired at an Azuma from 21 kilometers away. I hit 5 of the 6 shells. Even though I didn't even have great aim, I didn't even hit the middle part of the ship. But I still hit 5 out of 6. This shows you just how accurate these shells can be. And I did a follow-up, 2 out of 3, and I got a Citadel even. And this makes me not like the ship, because I think Slava is bad for the game. By the way, later on in the video I will show Slava in port, so you'll see the armor, etc. Her downside is that she isn't as good at close range. Namely, her armor isn't great for close range battleship encounters. She is a battleship. However, her bow and stern are 25mm, which means that basically every battleship can overmatch it. They can go through her front. On top of that, her Citadel sits quite high in the water compared to what you quite often get on other battleships. Say, I don't know, a Missouri that's on my team here. This all means that Slava is not a ship that wants to go close range. Actually, there is one other thing. Her accuracy doesn't improve quite as quickly as it does on other ships when you get closer and closer. That's not to say that she isn't more accurate close range, it's just that other ships get more accurate faster, or so I heard. And all of this means that she is going to be a ship that wants to stay at long range. And I hate this. Some of you might have noticed that I have been complaining recently about battleships that stay too far away on my team, or even the enemy team. And Slava, I think, is perfect for those players, because it encourages you to play like that. It encourages you to be far away in your battleship. However, I think this is a bad impact on the rest of the game. Look at this match right now. There are 3 battleships on each team. We have a Tier 8 Monarch, a Tier 9 Missouri, which, by the way, is pushing on the side. That's kind of weird, but then again, I am on the Russian server. And then we have a Tier 10 Slava. You would expect that the Tier 10 battleship would be the best at tanking, at pushing, and all those things. But in this case, that's not true, because I am playing the Slava, and Slava cannot do that. And I think this leads into matches that aren't quite as fun for everyone else, because now it will have to be the cruisers and the lower tier battleships that will have to tank instead, because I am not doing that in my Slava. And I think this is going to be incredibly common, and it's just going to frustrate other players. On top of that, it's going to be annoying to be punished from really far away. And if you look at it, I am far away from all the enemies. It's quite difficult for the enemies to get further away while still being able to engage someone. Other than the Conqueror and the Cleveland, I am over 20 kilometers from everything else on the enemy team. Yet, I am still easily able to pick a target to fire at. The Conqueror was angled? Fine, let's fire at this Nevsky. And I have no trouble hitting targets, right? You've seen it so far. Nevsky is usually a difficult ship to hit because she is fast, but I have no trouble. Of course, the one time I call it out, I actually completely missed the ship. Wow. Well, anyway. You've probably seen so far that I don't have much trouble hitting ships. However, I will say though that just because Slava isn't meant for close range engagements, and people aren't going to do many close range engagements with her, that doesn't mean she can't fight at least at medium range. Remember, we're still dealing with a battleship. She does still have 92,000 HP. She still has a decently thick Citadel armor plate, and her firing angles are very good. All of these combined means that Slava can, decently enough, tank enemy battleship shells, because they simply won't Citadel her easily. And it's not like you need to do a huge amount to offer tanking services to your team. You tank a little bit and then you go further away. And in these kinds of situations, Slava is actually pretty good because, well, you're accurate at range once you've taken a lot of damage. If you then retreat far away from the enemy can't really shoot you easily. But you get to take advantage of adrenaline rush and still just keep safely plowing away at the enemy. And then they will have to focus on somebody else on your team, which increases the amount of tankable HP, I guess. So, surprisingly, my team has been pushing on the eastern side. They're still actually pushing, which is something I really don't expect to see often, but here we are. This is one of those games where Slava would absolutely shine, because she gets to fire at the enemy, especially when they're not angled against her, because they're angled against somebody else. Also, there's a midway over there at 22 kilometers. That's quite far for most battleships. So let's try to see how accurate we are, because CVs tend to not maneuver too much. It should be easier to hit. Although this ship seems to be playing with her throttle, so it leads slightly less. I fired 6 shells. Okay, one of them is going off into La La Land, but the rest are actually going accurately. And I hit 5 of them at 22 kilometers. I even hit 2 into the Citadel, and keep in mind, I fired at close to the water level, right? Which often means that many shells will fall short of the enemy ship. But this time, there was no trouble at all. I can't believe that Missouri is still pushing. I wish I had teammates like that more often. Sadly, I think with Slava being added to the game, that's going to be less likely than before. Because when they pick the Slava, they're unlikely to be pushing like that Missouri is. Oh wow, a Citadel on that Venezia. I feel like I should start pushing at some point soon. The enemy is retreating and they're already quite far. They aren't showing nearly as much broadside to me anymore. And the selection of targets isn't as great. So it might be high time to start pushing. Because the enemy is getting further away now, and they aren't showing quite as much broadside to me anymore because there's a smaller selection of targets, as many of them have already been sunk or they have retreated further away. Although maybe this Sovetskaya Russia is going to put up a fight now. Or maybe not. There was no problem hitting the Citadel or penetrating it with Slava's amazing guns. So at this point the enemy has no chance. They have no CV, they have no battleships, it's only a bunch of cruisers. It makes sense why we're herding them into a corner essentially. Goodbye, Venezia. Maybe I should have pushed slightly earlier. Here we heard the horn of the Slava. Oh wow, that Azuma is still showing broadside. I expect her to sail slightly further away, as in turn away, so I aimed higher. That is something you need to do in Slava though. You need to have your aim be somewhat on point. It's not going, you don't have quite as much of the shotgun effect as you do in other battleships, so you do need to take that into account. As a result, you might miss at the, when you start playing the Slava quite a lot, but you'll get used to it. Nevsky again, huh? We're gonna get revenge this time. A Citadel. think she isn't going to be available for the next salvo, and I will have to switch over to the Worcester, who still seems to also happily be showing me broadside. I do expect her to turn slightly further away as well. Oh, she didn't. At least not nearly as much. But here you saw, despite the fact that she was so far away, the shotgun effect really didn't come into play. It was all about my aim. I just aimed too high, and so the shells went into the superstructure. So this time I'm going to aim slightly lower, as I expect her not to turn too much this time. And now it's just the Azuma, and I suppose the Shimakaze, who might torpedo me at some point, but we can see the red torpedoes on the screen, which means that she already torpedoed in the other direction. Taking a torpedo is never nice as a destroyer, but then having a follow-up bunch of shells makes it even worse. She might have launched one set of torps in my direction. I do have to keep that in mind, but I'm not sure if I care about it enough at this point, because there's only one enemy ship left, and maybe getting more damage here is slightly more important? Well, more enjoyable. She is gonna hit the border, and aiming on the border tends to be slightly more difficult, because you have to translate the ship movement onto the border movement, and that does make aiming somewhat harder, but it is something you can learn to do if you get experience. It just doesn't happen and often enough to get that experience. You also have to keep in mind which way the enemy ship is going to move and about how quickly. Here I think my aim isn't quite on point, but you can see the horizontal dispersion kind of going wide there, so it's not like it wouldn't have mattered too much anyway. I would have only been able to land one shell regardless what the dispersion was, regardless how I aimed. But remember, the longer the target sits on the border, the slower they start moving, which means that the easier it is to hit them, because all you have to do is aim basically where they are. Well, with some luck, I suppose. Or, yeah. This hasn't been going too well, has it? Come on, we can at least hit her this time. Come on, it's only 2k HP. We have to hit this time, right? Yes. So you just saw a glimpse of Slava, where I engaged from quite far away the entire game. Do you want lots of ships on your team doing the same thing? I'm not sure I want this. I mean, it would be great to play this once in a while, right? It could be quite fun. However, having, I don't know, half of my team's battleships be Slavas probably doesn't sound very appealing. Because, well, if they're far away, they're not tanking, so it means that my Hindenburg will have to go tank, my, I don't know, Minotaur will have to go tank, my Venezia will have to go tank, and stuff like that. Well, we did 207k damage. This time our accuracy was nowhere near as high as it was in some of my previous games. 68 out of 210 shells. However, almost the entire game I was 20 kilometers away, or further, from the targets I actually aimed at. So, let's take a look at Slava in port. First of all, let's go over the commander skills I used. Priority Target, Expert Marksman, Superintendent, Concealment Expert, Fire Prevention, Adrenaline Rush, and last, Basics of Survivability. Upgrades wise, I went with fairly standard, with one exception: Main Armaments Modification 1, Damage Control Modification 1, Aiming Systems Modification 1, Concealment, and the Reload Boost. However, what's different is the fact that I went for Propulsion. You see, I figured that in a Slava I would want to stay fairly far away from the enemy, and therefore I would want to stop my ship and then accelerate again, a decent amount of times, because I don't want to get too close to the enemy even if I'm pointing my nose towards them and still want to be moving. As a result, propulsion seems like a good idea, especially since I don't have to worry quite as much about fires and flooding, as I will not be quite as close as other battleships will be. However, another option would be to take damage control, and instead of basics of survivability, take something like Jack of all trades, or maybe if you have a different special captain, High Alert, and then something like Preventative Maintenance, IFA, or I don't know, Expert Loader, something like that, right? I'm sure you'll come up with something. But this is what I used. So, let's go over the stats of the ship. First of all, the armor scheme, which is probably the most important thing when you're talking about close-range battleship engagements. Or rather, one of the reasons why you don't want to do that in a Slava. As I mentioned earlier, she has a 25mm bow. As you can see, it's 25mm. And even the stern is 25mm, which means that battleship AP shells that I think almost anything she can meet other than I think Odin or something will be able to overmatch this. And that means that it's entirely possible to punish a Slava even if she's broadside on. Now you might say, oh, but she has an icebreaker, this will protect her Citadel. No, the icebreaker is still 25mm, which means that it's not going to help you too much. Against battleships at least. Now this side plate here is 100mm, so you're not going to go through this bit here. But from the very front, it's absolutely possible. Also notice that this red part here is the Citadel. It sits quite high in the water, as you can tell, right? But it is 370 and 350mm, which means that if you angle, and I think Slava can angle something like this, it's not the easiest thing to penetrate to be able to actually Citadel the Slava. From the front, the Citadel sits just as high in the water, as you can see, 350mm from there, so if you can land a shell from close range through the bow, you can absolutely Citadel the Slava, and punish her heavily for it. The deck armor is 32mm, so against HE she is not very resistant. Cruisers spamming HE at her will absolutely damage her as well, and, you know, the bow and stern are even worse for that. All in all, this means that Slava's armor just doesn't lend itself to close-range encounters. She doesn't have a great set of secondaries either, even though, actually, you know what, these secondaries are pretty decent. But you probably don't want to use them because of your, you know, how close you get. She does have decent concealment, 13.2 kilometers. For a tier 10 battleship, this is actually pretty damn good. It's not too far away from, I believe, the Conqueror even, or Thunderer. Maneuverability? Well, this is with flags, by the way, so 31 knot speed, 1090 meter turning circle, which is pretty huge, and a 16.3 second rudder shift. This is why I didn't want to go for rudder shift and went for propulsion instead, because the rudder shift isn't going to make too big of a difference due to the turning circle. The anti-air on the ship is excellent though, at least from what I saw. 6.6 kilometer range. You don't actually get this much range in most ships, I believe. Most ships do have less anti-air range, which makes her quite effective. And even the continuous damage is 436. And I mean, consider, or no, that's not 436, it's different. It's 203 for medium range and 500 for short range. So, it's pretty good. Like, this isn't the ship in whose anti-air you wish to loiter for long. And the main battery characteristics you've already seen, 29.5 second reload with the reload upgrade, so it's, I think, 33 seconds without, or something along those lines. Acceptable turret traverse, 12,000 damage with AP shells, and very good range and very good shell characteristics overall. So, Slava is a long-range fighter. It's a ship you wish to engage the enemy at long or medium range from. You don't want to get into too many close-range encounters, but you can, and it's entirely possible to use her armor to tank, right? While this bit here might be able to, while you might be able to overmatch this bit here, if the Slava comes at this kind of an angle, you're not going to Citadel her from here, right? You're simply not going to Citadel her like this. Which means that if you don't land your shells here at the front and aim more towards the middle, well, you probably aren't going to punish her too heavily. It's not going to feel too different from other battleships in those kinds of situations. And I think for random battles, those kinds of situations are the norm when you're dealing with most close-range encounters that aren't really, passing the other ship. And so I think Slava, as a battleship, she's fine. She's a great ship. Maybe even overpowered. And you can certainly argue that. But I simply think that she's just not good for the game, because she is going to encourage more long-range sniping from battleships. And I don't think we need more of that in the game. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I would like to thank the patrons on Patreon. Thank you very much for your continued support, and I hope I'll see you guys next time.